Today we're looking at 9 weird and sometimes scummy Magic the Gathering plays that actually forced Wizards to change the rules of the game. Number 9. Pithing Needle, Borborygmos. During the top 8 of Star City Games Charlotte in 2016, Bob Wong's Grishlebrand Reanimator deck was matched up against Bradley Carpenter playing Birthing Pod. In Game 1, Bob's deck did exactly what it was trying to do by reanimating a Borborygmos Enraged and using its activated ability to discard lands to deal 3 damage each until his opponent's life total hit 0. After dying to Borborygmos Enrage's ability in Game 1, Bradley Carpenter sideboarded in Pithing Needle, an artifact that lets you name a card and then stops any activated abilities from that card, with the goal being to shut down the Borborygmos kill. Luck was on Bradley's side. He had a Pithing Needle in his opening hand in Game 2, which he immediately played, naming Borborygmos to stop his opponent's combo kill and ensure a fair game of Magic. Or so he thought. A couple turns later, Bob drew the cards he needed to combo off, if only that pesky Pithing Needle wasn't around. But then Bob had an epiphany. He quickly left the table to go talk to a judge.
And it looks like he did name Borborygmos, so we have Gristlebrand and Borborygmos named with these Pithing Needles, just like we thought was going to happen with Bradley's sideboard. Yeah, so it looks like Bob did have a rules question away from the table. He's back. I imagine he was able to get the answer that he was looking for.
When he returned, he proceeded to execute his combo, reanimating Borborygmos Enrage and discarding lands to its activated ability to deal damage to Bradley.
Oh, did he name the wrong one?
We can see Bradley try to stop Bob by pointing out the Pithing Needle that was shutting down the activated abilities on cards named Borborygmos, to which Bob responds, he's not activating Borborygmos, he's activating Borborygmos Enraged. Part of the issue here is that Borborygmos is a Magic card. While everyone involved knew that Brad meant Borborygmos Enraged, the card he had just lost to the previous game, by just saying Borborygmos, he was technically naming another legal Magic card, and in the end the judge backed up Bob's sneaky play, giving him the Borborygmos Enraged kill in the win. As a result of the play, the community was even more enraged than Borborygmos, especially since everyone involved knew what card Bradley was naming with Pithing Needle when he played it, and it wasn't until later in the game that Bob realized there might be a way to rules lawyer a free win out of what Bob called a unlucky communication error. Bradley accepted the loss in stride, perhaps in part because of a prize split he had negotiated before the match, but Bob felt the need to address the situation in an article on Channel Fireball, in which he stated that his opponent's intent with Pithing Needle was 100% clear, and that the spirit of the rules were on Bradley's side. While Bob didn't go as far to actually apologize for stealing the win, he did say that he learned to be more careful with his decisions and that good sportsmanship is more important than simply winning. As a result of the play and the uproar surrounding it, Wizards decided that the spirit of the rule should be the literal written rule. Moving forward, players wouldn't need to say the exact name of the card they were naming with Pithing Needle or a similar effect, and instead they would just need to make it clear so both players understood what card they were naming. So, for example, Bradley could have said the Borborygmos he played in Game 1, or even just Borborygmos in that context probably would have sufficed. They also clarified that if there was any uncertainty about what card was being named, the opponent should make that player clarify. What this means is, under the current rules, Bradley naming Borborygmos would shut down the Borborygmos Enraged because everyone admitted they knew what card he was talking about, even though he didn't say the full name of the card. And if Bob was actually confused over which Borborygmos Brad was naming, which Bob admitted he wasn't, it would be his responsibility to ask Brad to clarify which Borborygmos he was intending to shut down. Have a Borborygmos you just gotta stop? Well, you can snag a Pithing Needle and more from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Number 8, the sneakiest Dryad Arbor of all time. Dryad Arbor is a unique card. While there's many lands in Magic that can turn into creatures, Dryad Arbor is the only land in Magic that is always both a creature and a land, and this has led to an interesting problem. Where do you put your Dryad Arbor on the battlefield? Traditionally in Magic, the battlefield is laid out in a pretty specific order, with lands in the back and creatures in the front. Well, unless you're Adrian Sullivan, but more on that in a little bit. So where do you put a Dryad Arbor that's both a creature and a land? Well, when Dryad Arbor first came out in 2007's Future Sight, this wasn't really that big of an issue because the unique Future Sight border really made Dryad Arbor stand out on the battlefield. It was almost impossible to confuse it for a normal land, even if it was backed by the other land lands on the battlefield, but this changed in 2012 with the release of From the Vault Realms, which reprinted Dryad Arbor, but with a normal border and with some art that made it look almost indistinguishable from a normal foil forest. The where do you put your Dryad Arbor issue finally came to a head at GP Leon in 2018, where in round 6, Hall of Famer Gabriel Nassif battled not just his opponent Thomas Langlots, but perhaps the sneakiest Dryad Arbor of all time. Nassif is playing Hollow 1, while Langlots is on Boggles. On turn 3, we see Langlots play his land for the turn, a Dryad Arbor, which he places back beside his lands rather than up in front with his creatures, and the announcers even point this out during the broadcast.
Yeah, and also remember that's a Dryad Arbor, again. Tricky but quite relevant, especially in the face of something like the menacing Flameblade Adept.
The next turn, Nassif, in typical Yellow Hat fashion, takes an agonizingly long time to figure out his attacks. Eventually, he swings with a flock of flying Flamewake Phoenixes and a menacing Flameblade Adept, trying to sneak in some damage past his opponent's only blocker, a huge lifelinking Slippery Boggle. As soon as the attacks are declared, the Dryad Arbor jumps into action, joining the Boggle to block the Flameblade Adept, much to Nassif's surprise and chagrin.
So I don't think he sees the Dryad Arbor here. Yeah.
Gab picks up the creature land multiple times, looking at it and putting it back down in befuddlement.
Incredulously checks out this Dryad Arbor.
Yeah, so this is because of the art on this one compared to the one from Future Sight. This one is less apparent that it is actually a creature, and the way Thomas played, he just put it alongside his land and it does look like a regular forest.
Yeah, it's a bit of an unusual situation. Of course, the Future Sight version of Dryad Arbor, very, very clearly an unusual card. This one, much closer to simply looking like a forest.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people have been talking about this, have talked about this in the past, that it is actually deceiving to play a card like this because it really doesn't really stand out. It's a foil land, basic foil forest, and the text box is just the power toughness is just so small. You can't really see it, but I think Gabriel Nassif decided to I should have probably paid more attention.
Before finally conceding the game. This play led to a huge conversation in the Magic community. Some question the ethics of springing a sneaky Dryad Arbor block from your mana base. Others called for the Dryad Arbor, or at least the From the Vault printing of Dryad Arbor, to just straight up be banned. Eventually, Wizards issued some new rules about where cards must be placed on the battlefield, which clarified that Dryad Arbor must be placed with your creatures rather than your lands, making the sneaky Dryad Arbor block a punishable offense in competitive Magic. Number 7, the colorless Cavern of Souls. Cavern of Souls became an all-star in tribal decks across formats pretty much from the day it was printed in Avacyn Restored, thanks to its ability to make creatures of a type of your choice uncounterable, while also fixing your mana. But in its infancy, Cavern of Souls wasn't nearly as powerful as it is today because of a weird quirk in the rules. If you read Cavern of Souls closely, you'll see that the land gives you two options. You can tap it to add a generic mana, or you can tap it to add a mana of any color, but you can only spend that mana on the creature of the type that you chose when you played your Cavern of Souls, and as an added bonus, if you choose the colored mana option, it also makes the creature uncounterable. Seems simple, right? Well, not exactly. Let's say you have a Cavern of Souls naming human on the battlefield and you want to cast a Reflector Mage. So you tap 2 Hollow Fountains and your Cavern of Souls and cast your Reflector Mage. The Reflector Mage can't be countered. Or can it? Well, according to the original rules on Cavern of Souls, your Reflector Mage was still very much counterable. This is because there was a weird rule that the default mode on Cavern of Souls was that it made generic mana when you tapped it. If you wanted your Reflector Mage to be uncounterable, you'd need to tap your 2 Hollow Fountains and your Cavern of Souls and explicitly say that you were making blue mana or white mana with the Cavern of Souls, even though there's literally no possible reason that you would want to make generic mana with the Cavern of Souls in that scenario. And this rule was as horrible as it sounds and super easy to abuse, which led to all kinds of scummy rules lawyering plays where someone would try to cast a creature with mana from Cavern of Souls thinking that it was uncounterable, only to have their opponent do the rules lawyering gotcha thing and point out, haha, you didn't specifically say you made colored mana with Cavern of Souls, as they countered their creature. The good news is this rule only lasted a couple of months before it was reversed. Under the new rule, if you use Cavern of Souls to cast a creature of the type that you had named, the default would be that everyone assumed that you made colored mana with Cavern of Souls and the creature was uncounterable, which was a devastating blow to rules lawyers everywhere. Number 6, LSV accidentally creates the London Mulligan rule. The Mulligan rule has a long and storied history in Magic, to the point where it might be worth doing an entire video on the hows and whys of its changes over the years, but today we're focusing on the creation of the most recent version of the Mulligan rule, known as the London Mulligan rule, for the location of the tournament where it first went into effect. Pro Tour Guilds of Ravnica was literally Wizards' dream. Their most popular pro player, Luis Scott Vargas, probably better known as LSV, not only made the top 8, but managed to grind his way all the way to the finals with Boros Aggro. Even better, LSV and his opponent, Andrew Ellenbogen, split the first 4 games of the finals, setting the stage for an epic climax to the tournament with a winner-take-all Game 5 for $50,000 and the trophy. And then disaster struck. The players drew their opening 7s, and Andrew quickly keeps his. Meanwhile, LSV looks at 5 lands and a couple of medium cards and mulligans. At the time, Magic used the Vancouver Mulligan rule, where every time you mulligan, you draw 1 less card. So first you draw 7, then 6, then 5, and so forth. But then if you mulligan, after you were all done mulliganing, you would get to scry 1 before the game started.
Luis is on a mulligan, and you can see it. Yeah. He's feeling it on his face. He is just going, please just give me something that I can keep.
Yeah, he had a hand of 5 lands, a Healer's Hawk, and a Benalish Marshal, and deemed it not worthy.
Oh no.
Luis Scott Vargas is going to 5 cards in the finals.
So LSV draws his 6-card hand and gets a 0-lander and immediately mulligans again.
When you're going down to 5 and you just want to draw Healer's Hawk, Primate into History of Benalia, need to have kind of that ideal opener. Is there even a land in this
There
hand?
is. It is a Clifftop Retreat. He's got a Tribunal, a Baffling, and a Sky Marcher.
That hand is extremely poor.
Luis Scott Vargas is mulliganing to 4 in the finals of the Pro Tour.
LSV draws his 5-card hand, sees a 1-lander and a bunch of expensive cards that he can't cast. This time he thinks for a while and then mulligans again. Finally, LSV draws a 4-card opening hand and keeps a pretty medium 1-lander out of necessity. You can't really mull to 3, you just have no chance with a 3-card starting hand. Andrew quickly ran over LSV in Game 5, thanks in large part to the fact that because of the mulligans, he started with nearly twice as many cards in hand, and what went down as one of the least climatic endings to a Pro Tour ever. And this led to a big conversation in the community about the mulligan rule, with some players stating that the anticlimactic ending of Pro Tour Guilds of Ravnica was a reason to change the rule. For his part, LSV in his tournament report said that the mull to 4 was pretty crushing, but he didn't think that the rules needed an overhaul or anything like that. It was just bad luck and part of the game. Well, LSV might not have seen his misfortune as a reason to change the mulligan rule. It seems that Wizards did. While they never explicitly stated that the infamous mull to 4 was the reason behind the change, just a couple months after the Pro Tour, they announced that they'd be testing a new mulligan rule.
This is a really exciting part here. We're actually testing out a new mulligan at this event.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's not news to me because we heard about it before the show. But I wanted the reaction. So tell us about the new mulligan rule that you're testing.
Right, so first I'll explain how the mulligan works, and then we'll talk more about the motivation behind it and that sort of thing.
Yep.
So the way that it works is if you choose to take a mulligan, you always draw back up to 7 cards, and then once you're satisfied with your 7-card hand and decide to keep it, you put a number of cards from your hand back on the bottom of your library equal to the number of times you mulliganed. So let me give an example. So I draw my first 7-card hand, and I don't like it for whatever reason, I have no lands or whatever, I decide to take a mulligan. I shuffle my hand back into my library, I draw a new hand of 7 cards, and this time I like it, I decide to keep, so I put 1 card from my hand back on the bottom of my library and keep 6.
Okay.
So you're still going down from 7 to 6 to 5 and so on, but each time you're getting to look at 7 new cards before you decide whether to keep and commit to that, and then putting that number back on the bottom of your library.
After a test run at Mythic Championship 2, Wizards implemented the rule game-wide with the release of Core Set 2020 in June of 2019, and the London Mulligan rule was born. Number 5, the Between Turns phase. So before we get into this, I should say, the Between Turn phase isn't technically a phase. If you read the Magic rulebook, phase actually means something and refers to like the steps you take to complete your turn. The Between Turn phase isn't a technical phase. It was just this weird period of time that existed between turns where certain things could happen. The Magic rules were really weird in the early years. So for a brief period of time, between the release of 5th edition in 1997 and 6th edition in 1999, there was this weird phase that wasn't actually a phase that happened after one player's end step, but before the next player's untap step, which became called the between turn phase. And the reason this weird space of time existed was it was to give a window for certain triggered abilities, and most specifically the untapping of Time Vault, to actually work with the wording and rules that existed at the time. For some reason, during this weird non-phase phase between turns that really only existed to make Time Vault work, you were also allowed to activate mana abilities. You couldn't do anything else. You couldn't cast spells, you couldn't activate other abilities, but you could make mana, which ended up causing some major problems with the card Wall of Roots. So if you read Wall of Roots closely, it says you can put a -0, -1 counter on it to make a green mana, but you can only do this once each turn. Well, technically, between turns isn't during anyone's turn, which let players ignore the once per turn restriction on Wall of Roots and essentially turn Wall of Roots into a 1-card infinite mana combo. The problem, of course, is you were making this infinite mana during this between turn non-phase phase, and you couldn't do anything else during that phase. You couldn't cast a spell or even activate non-mana abilities, but players found a way around this. So in Magic, mana empties from your mana pool at the end of steps and phases, but again, the between turn phase wasn't technically a phase, so the mana wouldn't go away when it ended. It would carry over to the next step, which is your untap step, although unfortunately you can't do anything during your untap step either other than untap your permanents. But Magic players realized if they could find a way to skip their untap step, they would jump right to their upkeep, and during their upkeep they would be able to actually cast spells or activate abilities. So the idea was you would make infinite mana with Wall of Roots during the between turn phase, and then play something like Stasis or Sands of Time, which would skip your untap step and put you right into your upkeep. And then during your upkeep, all that mana you made between turns with your Wall of Roots would still be hanging out, and you could dump all that mana into Magma Mine and then sacrifice it to deal infinite damage to your opponent, which created a deck now infamously known as Wall of Boom. While record keeping back in the late 90s is pretty sketchy, it seems that the infinite combo with Wall of Boom lasted maybe a week or two before Wizards decided that it was either BS or against the spirit of the game, depending on which source you read, which led to them just removing the between turn rule from the game altogether to kill the combo deck. Number 4, Sullivan's Backwards Battlefield. For most of Magic's life, there weren't strict rules about where on the battlefield you needed to place your cards or how you place them there, which led to some interesting situations. One of the most unique battlefield setups comes from longtime Wisconsin pro Adrian Sullivan. Sullivan not only put his lands in front of his creatures, but he also played with all of his cards facing towards his opponents rather than towards himself. The reasons for this strange setup are actually super simple. First, as far as having lands in front of creatures, this is basically just because early Magic rulebooks weren't very clear on how you were supposed to set your cards, and some puzzles in early Magic magazines used the land in front of creature setup, so Adrian's entire playgroup played with their lands in front of their spells. That's just how they learned to play the game from these early rulebooks. Second, back in the mid-90s, Magic card sleeves weren't a thing, and the community center in Wisconsin where Sullivan started playing Magic had super rough tables. He was known for playing odd cards that most other players didn't use, which meant his opponents were always dragging his cards over the rough table so they could read them. Eventually, Adrian decided to change his battlefield setup to save his poor unsleeved cards by having them face towards his opponents so they'd be able to read them without reaching out for them and dragging them over the table. Eventually, Sullivan started playing in more and more competitive events and brought his unique setup with him to the Pro Tour, at least for a while. As Magic grew and tournaments started to be broadcast on streaming services like Twitch, Wizards decided they needed to standardize the battlefield for the sake of streaming coverage. In 2015's Pro Tour Brussels, Wizards told Sullivan that he needed to start playing with his cards facing towards himself for the sake of coverage, and then when Dominaria released in 2018, Wizards made a rule that creatures must be placed in front of your lands. While I'm sure there were some other players who got wrecked by this rule change as well, it will always be associated with Adrian, who was by far the most well-known player to use the now banned battlefield setup. Number 3, the Pro Tour Riot. Remember that Magic the Gathering ad that played on MTV in the 90s? While it's mostly just a cringy piece of nostalgia, near the end of the ad, one of the spectators mentions that Mark Justice started a riot at an event last year.
Pro Tour 4, the MTV Invitational. presented by Magic the Gathering.
Enjoy too? Okay, no problem. All right, what do you got for me, man?
Boy, Justice is really putting the pressure on.
These guys don't look that tough.
Pretty strong play.
You don't think Justice is tough? He started a riot at a tournament last year.
Well, you probably thought this was just a joke trying to make Magic players look tough. It's actually a very true story from Pro Tour Los Angeles in 1997. A player by the name of David Mills managed to make the top 8 of the event, but he had a habit that drove the judges crazy. Dave would get a little bit too excited, and he'd play a spell before tapping his lands for mana, which was technically against the rules, which said you needed to tap your lands and then play your spells. Throughout the event, Mills got some warnings from judges telling him he needed to tap his lands first before casting his spells, and Mills would always apologize for the mistake, but changing the way you've always played Magic midway through a Pro Tour is super tough, so sooner or later Mills would forget and play a spell before tapping his lands and get another warning. Eventually the judges had had enough and told Mills if he made the mistake again, he'd be disqualified from the tournament. Mills apologized again, and by this time Mills had made the finals of the tournament, so we'd only have to remember to tap his lands before casting his spells for one more match. The best of 5 finals started and things were looking great for Mills. He won 2 of the first 3 games, which meant if he could win game number 4, he would be the Pro Tour Championship, and Mills soon found himself in a good position. If he could draw a swamp, a single swamp, he should be able to win the game. Mills drew for his turn, and it was a swamp. He quickly played the land and went to cast his game-winning spell, but in his excitement, he forgot to tap his lands before casting the spell. He immediately realized his mistake and apologized, but the judge disqualified him on the spot in game 4 of the finals with a potentially game-ending spell on the stack, and took away the $16,000 in prize money he would have won for making the finals. This didn't go over well with the other players at the event who were watching the finals on TV from a side room at the convention center. No one took the you need to tap your lands before playing your spells rules seriously, and they felt that a Pro Tour being decided by such a silly technicality was a slight to them as pro players and to the game as a whole. Mark Justice, who was the biggest star in Magic at the time, rallied the players who chaotically rushed the stage as Wizards started the trophy ceremony, crowning Mills' opponent Tom Hovey the champion, to demand answers. Eventually the chaos, now known simply as the Players' Riot, was calmed by an eloquent speech by tournament manager Andrew Fitch, in which he promised to give Mills his prize money that had been initially taken away by the disqualification. Sadly, there's no known video of the riot itself, even though the tournament did have video coverage, making it one of the most iconic pieces of lost media in Magic. As a result of the riot, and probably because the rule was pretty unnecessary and a bit absurd to begin with, when the 6th edition rule changes came out a couple of years later, Wizards dropped the you gotta tap your lands before casting your spells rule. Today, you play your cards and tap your lands in whatever order you want. Number 2. The meaning of combat. Let's say you're playing a game of Magic and you say, go to combat. What are you expecting to happen? What phase are you expecting to end up in? If you answered the phase named beginning of combat, you would be very wrong. Well, at least you would have been wrong if you were playing competitive Magic 5 years ago, which is something Cesar Segovia learned the hard way. Well, 7-0 at Pro Tour Aether Revolt. Cesar was playing a Rakdos Vehicles deck. His plan was to go to the beginning of combat step and then use Weldfast Engineer to crew of Heart of Ghired, turning it into a 4/4 flying vigilant creature. So as most Magic players would, Cesar said combat and then attempted to crew his vehicle. His opponent called the judge, who asked Cesar if he said combat, and Cesar said that yes he did.
He declared combat and he's trying to crew with that.
Okay, so is it correct you declared combat?
Yeah, I say combat.
Yeah?
Yes, and I don't, I try to.
And then you crew it?
Yes.
Okay, that's not allowed. Before you declare in combat means that you want to declare your attackers. That's how the shortcut works. If you did not crew your vehicle, our policy is that you cannot crew your vehicle after you ask for combat. If you want to do an effect before attacking, you have to announce that before mentioning combat.
then I can do that crew?
You cannot crew, no.
And the judge explained that saying combat means he was going to the declare attack step, and it was too late to crew the vehicle. This situation was further complicated by the fact that Wildfast Engineer has an ability that triggers at the beginning of combat.
But my trigger.
Well, he missed his trigger because...
No, I only say combat because it's the beginning of combat, and I don't try trigger because
Yeah, Cesar has a good point here. So
Yeah,
the way
I
this
believe
actually
he's correct.
works is that after you end your main phase, there's a beginning of combat step where things like this trigger go on the stack, and he wanted to crew his vehicle in that. And the judge was saying that the standard shortcut is actually, when you say, I'm going to go to combat, is that you're saying, I want to go to my declare attacker step and
Right.
skip over it. So Cesar's clarifying that with the judge, and we'll see how it ends up.
His point is that he has a beginning of combat trigger, and he
Yeah.
wants to crew with that trigger, presumably still on the stack if he's going to that.
That's okay, that's not an issue. But what happens after?
So it pays to be precise at the Pro Tour, but from my understanding, Cesaro actually was handling this correctly. But we'll see how things play out from here.
That's what I heard as well.
After calling over an additional judge, they ruled that by saying combat, Segovia had skipped right past the beginning of combat phase, even though there was an ability which should trigger there that Segovia clearly remembered. You can see it on the video coverage, and was in the declare attack phase, and the Weldfast Engineer trigger was missed. The ruling felt bad for a couple of reasons. For one, watching the match, it was pretty clear that Caesar hadn't forgotten his Weldfast Engineer trigger. He just legitimately thought that saying combat would move him to the beginning of combat phase. Making it feel even worse was that English is Caesar's second language. Caesar's from Panama, and if you look at his Magic ELO page, you'll see he really had only played in a couple of tournaments before the Pro Tour, and they were all in Costa Rica. Is it really fair to expect a Spanish-speaking Costa Rican Magic player to be familiar with a counterintuitive English language shortcut?
Spanish? I can collect one. Sure.
Start actually requesting a Spanish-speaking judge, which is also a very good idea.
That's a good idea,
Just
too.
making
Just to
sure,
make
making sure
sure.
you're communicating clearly.
Yeah.
Eventually, Segovia asked for a Spanish-speaking judge who helped explain the situation, but the ruling itself didn't change. This led to a huge uproar in the community. Some people blamed Segovia's opponent, Thuen Nguyen, for calling the judge, saying it was rules lawyering. The vitriol from the community was intense. From Reddit to Twitter to Facebook, one of the most interesting takes came from Kai Booty, probably the greatest Magic player of all time, who talked about in how his nearly 3 decades of playing Magic, he had never heard of combat meaning declare attacks before, stating that he and everyone else he played with have said combat to go to the beginning of combat phase forever, and he couldn't find any references to combat meaning declare attacks in a Google search either. He also called out the language barrier and said he was tempted to root for Nguyen going 0-8 on the next day of the tournament for how he handled the situation. Nguyen struggled to deal with the hate, posting on Facebook that he had to leave the venue to cry between rounds and wanted to quit Magic, which was predictably met with mixed responses from the community, with some saying he did nothing wrong and encouraging him, and others thinking the post was an attempt to rehabilitate his image after the controversy. As a result of this controversy, Wizards announced a new rule for how combat will be handled. With a bunch of confusing language, it basically got rid of the if you say combat, you're in the declare attack step rule. While it sucks that such an unfair situation needed to happen on camera at a Pro Tour to bring about this rules change, the new rule ended up being even more important than anyone realized at the time. For the first 25 years of Magic, beginning of combat triggers were incredibly rare, with only a handful of mostly unplayable cards triggering at the beginning of combat, but over the past few years, we've seen them become an essential part of the game, with many popular cards like God Pharaoh's Gift, Arclight Phoenix, Bird-clad, Fight Rigging, Greasefang, Luminarch Aspirant, and more triggering at the beginning of combat. I don't even want to imagine how bad the old rule, where saying combat meant declare attacks for some reason, would play with current Magic design. Number 1. Kibler's missed trigger. Pro Tour Austin in 2009 is remembered, at least in part, for an epic quarterfinals match between the handsomest man in Magic, or I guess the handsomest man in Hearthstone now, Brian Kibler, and Evangelos Papastorakis, who I'm probably going to call Pops for the rest of the video because I know I'm going to butcher that name. Apologies, Evangelos. After falling behind 2-0 in the best of 5 match, Kibler's Grove of the Burn Willow Zoo deck made a huge comeback against Pop's Hypergenesis brew, winning 2 games in a row to force a decisive Game 5. As the game begins, Kibler plays a couple of noble hierarchs while Pop executes his game plan, casting Demonic Dread to cascade into Hypergenesis, which allows players to put as many permanents as they wish from their hand onto the battlefield for free. Things are looking grim for Kibler, considering that the best creature in his deck is a Baneslayer Angel, while the Hypergenesis deck is full of expensive finishers to chain to play, like Bogart and Hellkite, Progenitus, Akruma Angel of Fury, Sundering Titan, and Angel of Despair. As the players begin putting permanents into play, Kibler doesn't have much to offer, just a couple of Meddling Mages, which would have been amazing a turn earlier to stop Hypergenesis, but at this point are mostly just Grizzly Bear. Pops, on the other hand, slams a 10/10 protection from everything Progenitus, followed by an Angel of Despair, which blows up any permanent when it enters the battlefield. But this is where things get a bit weird. For some reason, Pops forgets his Angel of Despair trigger, which is a problem, because when you read Angel of Despair closely, you'll see that its ability is not a May ability. When it enters the battlefield, you must blow up a permanent. This was obviously accidental, because blowing up a permanent here is hugely beneficial for Pops, because the only tiny chance Kibler has of winning the game post Hypergenesis is drawing a land which would allow him to play a Baneslayer Angel and try to race Progenitus with Baneslayer's lifelink. If Pops uses Angel of Despair to blow up a land or a Noble Hierarch, there is essentially 0 ways for Kibler to win the game. Kibler doesn't remind Pops about the mandatory Angel of Despair trigger. At the time, it seemed possible that both players and all of the judges somehow all missed this same very important trigger in the top 8 of a Pro Tour, but we'll come back to this in a minute. Kibler proceeds to top deck the land and slam Baneslayer Angel. The lifelink of Baneslayer Angel, alongside the 2 exalted triggers from Noble Hierarch and a Path to Exile to get rid of the Angel of Despair, is enough for Kibler to take 10 damage a turn from the Progenitus and still win the race. A few turns later, Kibler swings for lethal with the Angel, completing one of the most improbable comebacks in Pro Tour history. Now, you might think that the story ends here, a great comeback after both players managed to miss a very important trigger, but the coverage of the event on GGS Live shows a bit of banter between the players as they pick up their cards after the match.
Kibler falls back in his chair.
Afterwards, because I knew when you put the Angel. Yeah.
Wow.
And Kibler mentions that he had the Baneslayer in hand when Hypergenesis resolved, but chose not to put it into play because he knew that the Angel of Despair would just kill it and then he couldn't win, and this raised some eyebrows. Not putting Baneslayer into play with Hypergenesis is perfectly legal. You don't have to put anything into play with Hypergenesis, and that was a very good play by Kibler, but Kibler talking specifically about playing around Angel of Despair's trigger made it seem pretty unlikely that Kibler had simply forgotten about the trigger like Pops had. A few rounds later, Kibler won the Pro Tour, but not without accusations of cheating. Triggers in Magic are weird, especially mandatory triggers like Angel of Despair, which by the rules you can't miss. While the player who controls the trigger, so in this case Pops, is primarily responsible for remembering the trigger, the rule at the time was that for mandatory triggers, the opponent also shares responsibility for resolving the trigger because they need to maintain a proper game state, which means according to the rules, Kibler needed to essentially remind Pops to resolve his Angel of Despair trigger. Well, pretty much everyone agreed that both players did something wrong here. Exactly what they did wrong was up for debate. It was pretty clear that Pops should have gotten a warning for missing his own trigger, even though it was clearly accidental. Like, Pops lost this match because he forgot his trigger, so there's no way he did it on purpose. Meanwhile, opinions on what should happen to Kibler varied, with some people believing he should have just gotten a warning for failing to maintain a proper game state since he didn't remind Pops of the trigger, while others argued that it could have been cheating or fraud, which would have given Kibler a disqualification without prizes. Either way, as a result of this missed trigger and the controversy surrounding it, Wizards changed the rules regarding triggers. While you are still responsible to remember your own triggers, an intentional intentionally choosing to ignore one of your own triggers is straight up cheating, the rule change made it so you're no longer required to remind your opponent about a missed trigger, even if it's a mandatory trigger, and even if that trigger is beneficial for you. Basically, while Kibler's missed trigger at Pro Tour Austin was against the rules at the time, Wizards sort of determined that it was actually the way the game should be played and that he kinda did the right thing, so they changed the rules so now Kibler's play would be 100% legal. Need even more Magic? Well, check out our video about the biggest cheaters to ever play the game, or maybe the one about the best creature from every single year of the game's history.